This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. This season, we're partnering with Democracy Exchange, Canada's Democracy Summit, taking place April 16th to 18th in downtown Toronto. The summit tackles today's most urgent civic issues over 3 days of programming, including inspiring speakers, thought-provoking expert panels, and hands-on workshops. As a Progress Canada listener, you can save 20% off registration by using this code, Lightbulb at DXC26. Visit democracyexchange.org to register today. So we are back for the first time this year with this particular panel. This is on Ontario politics, and I think we were getting as partisan and insidery as you possibly can, because we'll be talking about the Ontario Liberal leadership race and how it's just kicked off today, actually, as we're recording. The rules were put out over the weekend, and we now have a lot of details about the race, including the timeline that'll be operating over. So before we kick things off, I want to reintroduce our panel for those who maybe forgot who we all are over the course of Christmas and everything that has followed. Perhaps we can start with Daryl. Daryl, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Daryl Dean here. I'm the former Digital and Creative Director for the Liberal Party of Canada, former advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and now a freelance digital and creative communications specialist.
I'm Alex Mather. I started my political career in the US, working for President Obama's campaign strategists, and then came here, as Teresa mentioned, to do it as a senior advisor to then Premier Kathleen Wynne. And now I spend my day building affordable housing as VP of Development at Collective Marquee.
I'm Jordan Ray. I've been in politics for around 10 years. I was the party's organization and communications lead during the 2020 leadership race. And in the last leadership race, I was the deputy campaign manager and in charge of communications for Dil Shamji. And now I'm a freelance communications guy, trying to help people figure out what to say and how to say it.
Can I hire you to help me figure out what to say on this podcast?
Sure. I'm here.
And of course, while you were doing that math, Jordan, that made me do math, which should never happen. But I think my first official campaign as a staffer or like hardcore volunteer is approaching 20 years ago now, which is, but I've also formerly worked at the party office, much like Jordan, in a communications role. Was digital fundraising lead for OLP in a number of different campaigns. Was on the election platform writing team. I was the director of communications and government under the deputy premier, and I was a speechwriter for Premier Wynne during her last campaign. I wrote all these things down because I can never actually remember any of them when it comes to saying it. So this is why we make show notes, of course. So I want to get into the rules of the race. So Executive Council met over the course of the weekend, and they unexpectedly, I think to most people, almost immediately put out the results of their meeting and the vote that was taken. So I thought it was interesting that they did a bit of a comms push around it. They did a proper leadership microsite where they had a bunch of details on it. It was all branded, all that kind of stuff. So just a run through the highlights here. So there's something called the official call, which is when the leadership kicks off. So we actually have two official calls, which maybe we'll get into because I think we all have opinions about this. But part one of the official call starts today, February 9th, the date we're recording. And that's for the sake of the Elections Finances Act. It's so that candidates can start fundraising. They can register with Elections Ontario. Did I say Canada? The Elections Finances Act is the Ontario Act. They can start fundraising. They can register with the organization itself to actually start collecting those dollars. They can spend money. Really, really important for campaigns. The next official call is actually July 3rd, and this is for internal party rules. And we think, and we'll go over this, but we think it's because there's actually a mandatory minimum number of days and maximum number of days between the official call and the actual appointment of a new leader. So they have set that for July so that the actual winner reveal date can be in November. So we've also got candidate nomination deadline. That's going to be July 31st. So we have about 6 months from now, where anyone can still jump in, which perhaps will lead to some last minute drama, perhaps will not. Membership deadline, the deadline to become a member and participate in the process will be September 7th, unless you're a student at a student club, in which case that'll be September 25th, because of course they'll be going back to campuses over those few weeks. And then online voting, this is a new innovation for our party finally, oh my God, will be taking place from November 9th to Friday, November 20th, which allows the winner to be revealed at a special in-person event on November 21st. So this brings up the first question, which has been the question on everybody's mind. It's what everyone's been whining about online. When's the race going to start? How long is it going to be? Please, God, don't put it into 2027. All of these things are things we have heard. It's been one of the biggest debates in this process so far, and we finally have an answer. We're going to conclude the race in November. What does everybody think about that? Daryl, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, so not quite 2027, but certainly very late in the year 2026. I think where my mind initially goes, having been involved in leadership campaigns in the past, is just that's such a long time to be running a campaign. And, a lot of these campaigns will, function mostly, with volunteers who contribute when they can, but each campaign, including the candidates themselves, but the campaigns will have some sort of staff who are kind of dedicated to this over the course. And so that's a really long time for them. It's definitely a huge slog. And it's a long time also for to be spending money. You talk about staff, you talk about tools that you need to have, online mailing platforms, CRMs, websites, all of this stuff ultimately costs money to have running. So, asking everyone to kind of engage in this for 10 months, almost 11 months. It's certainly a long time. But on the other side, obviously, it does give the candidates a lot of time to go out in communities and meet people, especially over the summer. Lots of barbecue circuits, things like that. So definitely that's the trade-off. And I get there's some specific reasons why the timing is what it is, but to me it seems long.
Yeah, I think I agree with Daryl. And thinking back to the last race, there were times when it was difficult under the best of circumstances to keep the team together and keep a sense of momentum going. And you really get a drop off during the summer. I don't know if there's any way around it, just because of the way that having the membership cut off and then that kind of dominoes into the other cutoffs and if you look at when the membership cutoff is versus when the actual vote is, it's about the same length of time as it was last time. So it's just starting, do you start now or do you just start it, in 4 weeks to make the campaign itself shorter? That doesn't seem like there would be a lot of point to that. So you get an 8-week longer race than last time, which is more than a full federal general election campaign. But yeah, I don't see how you can really move the membership cutoff, really further back, because you'd get so much pushback from student clubs. They're a big part of the process, and each of them gets 50 points under the whole membership points weighting system that we decided on for the last race. There's a lot more youth clubs now at the riding level as well, and there used to be even just 3 years ago. So what are the positives about a longer race? Well, it's more muscle building, more time for the candidates to test themselves against each other and grind it out. And hopefully that means that the person who emerges is a stronger candidate.
Yeah. And I think the best leadership races clarify purpose for parties. And when they run this long, that they typically just expose drift. And I think it's really important, given the length of it, that the party stays on mission, which is regaining government. Anything less than that, and you're still, I think, sort of out in the wilderness to some degree. And so, on the one hand, like you said, Jordan, it gives an opportunity to sort of clarify the why and engage with the real substantive questions that are very often shunted to the side in these things. But it also leaves a lot of time for unforced errors, and long races demand better organizations. Like this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. It's an endurance test for fundraising lists, for the candidate themselves, for the staff, for the volunteer morale. And so there's a lot that can go wrong in such a long period. And I think, every campaign needs to remind themselves that the North Star here is not winning the leadership race. It's convincing everyone that they can be premier.
I always say it's a bad sign if I'm doing math, but I'm constantly trying it out and trying to see if I can do it one more time. But so I looked back at the races. I wrote an article about this a month ago about past races, because one of the biggest conversations we've heard is how dare the party do this? And I'm a fan of being outraged myself. We all know this. I love to flip out about things, but when it comes to dates for a leadership race, I don't think this is a moral failing or positioning. I think this is just a decision that was made. There's different opinions. So I wanted to go back and look at the past races. So in the last 45 years or so of races, so going back to 1982, I think before all of us were born at this point, none of us are that old. So going back that far, this is back to the race that David Peterson won. That was actually the shortest race in the last 45 years. And that one was 341 days after the 1981 election. So this is something I look at because we always go, oh, the race is so long because it's X number of days after the official call. But really, to the average Ontario voter, none of that matters. You're really looking back to since the last election, when did you put a leader in place and how much time do they have until the next election? So 1982 was the really short one. The longest one was actually in 2020, the race that selected Stephen Del Duca as leader. So that race was 640 days after the 2018 election. Now, the party did a bunch of work over that time. They had an AGM where they voted not to move ahead with changes to how we select our leader. They reversed that after that election. The following election did not go well, of course. But there was some internal party work that was done in between the election and the leadership. Remains to be seen if we will be doing that here. We did have an AGM in the fall that obviously was more about whether we're going to stick with the leadership we had or not. Spoiler, we did not, and that's why we're doing this. But I don't expect another AGM or anything like that, or a policy conference in the interim period between the start of this leadership race and the end, because there's a lot the party's working on. But I will say, the math puts this leadership race by the time it ends at 632 days, or 1 year, 8 months, and 25 days from the last election, which would make it the second longest race in the last 45 years. So people do have a point that it is a pretty long race, and there's some fallout that happens with that. So in terms of the candidates you get, we've obviously got municipal elections coming up in Ontario. So that means you're likely not going to have a lot of people who are maybe going to run for mayor otherwise if they don't become leader, because we do see that a lot. We always have these conversations about how dedicated a politician is to a specific role they're running for, but they do tend to go run for something else if that doesn't work out. This happens all the time in politics. It happened with Stephen Del Duca and Andrew Horwath, of course, when they did not become premier. So we see this a lot. And by extending this to a month after the municipal elections finish in Ontario, that means you're probably not going to have a lot of mayoral candidates try and make the jump to provincial politics, or councillors. And there's some Toronto councillors who were maybe eyeing this. So those people are out. The other part, and this is actually something I want to ask Daryl about, because, you had the most recent leadership race experience. You did the federal campaign last year, and your member was a sitting MP. We've got a bunch of sitting MPPs who are interested in this role. We've got a sitting MP who has declared. And can you talk a little bit about how much, an actual politician's salary really helps in a long race? Because this is something that we don't talk about a lot, but when you're trying to take time off from your day job that is not politics adjacent, that doesn't come with a travel budget to different parts of the province as you're doing a Scafia tour for the budget or something like that, that actually does play a role in how much time you can take off from work and how available you can be to the race. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, with the federal leadership that happened, obviously it was a much different situation. I mean, we were up and down in what felt like weeks as opposed to months. So certainly that had a huge difference. But in the federal one, I worked with Karina Gould, and as an Ontario member, it's not like she was traveling outside of Southern Ontario for work, right? Ottawa to Burlington is not a very far trip. So that number really impacted us a lot. But you make a great point. And when you think about, I was mentioning this about the staff, like thinking about the staff you have to pay, but ultimately these candidates, especially, in the summer, it's going to be a lot of that kind of glad handing. I think that because it's such a long race, we'll see a bit of a flurry of activity off the start. We'll get a bunch of people kind of declaring, some money being raised, and then we're going to see a big die off. And it's going to be really hard for these folks to kind of maintain that momentum. And it's going to be especially hard if the folks who are running do indeed have a full-time job, that requires their attention outside of what they're doing for the race. Obviously, having someone who works in politics, I think, is really where, because everything they do is kind of in that vein, in the public, meeting with people. So I think that that's where, you certainly get an advantage when you're a sitting politician. But obviously, those have limits, and there's rules put in place as to what you can do, and parliamentary resources versus party resources, and so it all kind of factors in to kind of give you a bit of a non advantage, I would say.
Jordan, I wanted to ask you more about the logistics of this. Obviously, I have done a number of leadership races from inside. So has Daryl. So have you.
Right.
But I think you have been more involved in recent years than perhaps some of the rest of us on the internal side of it. And can you talk about some of the things that come up and why that long window is so important? Like we were all texting earlier today about what the verification process is going to be, because we're of course moving to an entirely new voting method, which does take some time to figure out and get right, which I think we've all agreed is part of why this announcement has taken so long to get to in the first place. But there's some other stuff you have to do, like email verification, for example. We were just lamenting people who share emails and how that's really terrible for ID purposes in this kind of event. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what are some of the nitty-gritty things that require a timeline like this?
On the email bit, for those listening, one of the things that you do as part of a leadership campaign, and this wasn't my role, but you have a data chair or people responsible for the database of the people that you sign up, and you've got emails and first names, last names, and the information that you need to have as part of the party's membership requirements, which are released with the leadership rules. And this means that you have to basically batch them all in an Excel sheet and give them to the party and wait for them to be verified. And then how many of the members that you signed up are actually members that are able to vote. So in the past, this email verification thing could be a really big thing. And the reason why is that there are organizers out there who like to, as a tactic, upload a bunch of stuff in the Excel document that isn't actually attached to a real person. And then it allows them to say, yes, we submitted, 100,000 membership forms to the party office. We've done such a great job organizing. And that's part of the smoke and mirrors of these things, right? People are 100,000 memberships, and the party won't call them on it because that's not the party's role, because the party is neutral. What this means, though, with an authentication process is that for every email that is uploaded as part of a membership, which is required, people will have to go into that email inbox and verify that they've received the email, just like you do when you're doing your banking, you're resetting your password or something like that, right? So that means that all of those sort of paper memberships suddenly evaporate quite quickly. And then you get to see how many memberships are real or not. Another thing I'll mention real quick is that the length of the race means that there's a lot of off-ramps in terms of the fees that you have to pay. You have to pay $150,000 worth of fees to stay in it until the end. But just to get in, you need $50,000, $25,000 upfront plus a $25K deposit. And then it's every 4 weeks, you have to pay another $25,000 until the end of the race. So this gives sort of little engine that could campaigns the chance to get in and be let's see if we can make some magic. And then if they can't, then they can be pack up their toys and go home without getting in too deep financially.
It's a really good point, because we have seen that in the federal NDP race, where some of the candidates have been helping each other raise money to stay in the race up until the point where everybody's, like fully solidified. I really like the point about the verification process, because like it's so funny to me. Like when the membership number comes out, there was a lot of consternation last time. I think you guys probably remember, where it was like, oh, is this the number? It could be as high as that, da 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 da. And then all the campaigns take credit for the same members that get signed up. And it's always this debate of like, how strong really is your support? And I always find that hilarious. Like, it's just a really, really funny part of the campaign, where there's a lot of shenanigans that go on, and there's news releases flying all over the place. And it's just really hilarious.
It's out there, right? Like you see like 30,000 members and people be like, oh, like looks like they're doing better than we thought. And it changes the narrative and it changes the race.
Exactly. Alex, I wanted to talk to you about the real world before we move off of this timeline question, because one of the main things I've been seeing online, and maybe you guys have too, is this idea of like, province is in really, really rough shape. And by waiting longer, from a narrative perspective, we're basically telling people, hey, we're in no rush, things are fine, Ford's doing an okay job. Like, it does negate everything we're saying about the destruction he's wreaking across the province. Are you finding that out, sort of in the real world? Like, you're in the housing sector, like there's real world stakes for waiting to get going and offering an alternative vision?
I don't think most people are thinking about the OLP at all right now. And that sort of underscores the importance of this whole process and getting it right, because the party is adrift, more or less, at least in the sort of, popular zeitgeist. I think, there seems to be kind of an inevitability to Ford being the premier. I've heard lots of people in casual conversation sort of either bemoan or celebrate the notion that he'll get to be premier for as long as he wants to be, or for as long as, he can, or until he thinks he's got a good shot at becoming prime minister. And so, when that's the zeitgeisty thing, they don't think about the normies don't think about the OLP at all right now. So, again, ties back to mission number one in all of this isn't, rebuild the party, nip around the edges, so much as it is regain relevance.
Yeah, and I mean, to that point, Alex, I mean, generally the normies, as you call them, which I love, I used to call them RPs, or real people, these folks aren't paying attention to politics writ large outside of an election. So like, they may see one story about Doug Ford, or they may have seen a story that said like OLP leadership kicks off, but that's as much thought as a lot of folks are going to put into this until there's an election at the doorstep, until it's time to make a decision. So really this is really about focusing in on your members, focusing in on building those volunteer roles, building up practice door knocking and doing field stuff, and figuring out new ways to do digital field. And there's so many different things. And this is more about like internal training. The whole process more is about that than really about, changing hearts and minds of Ontarians, because that's not going to happen until we're actually in an election and it's a week away and it's time to start thinking about who I'm going to vote for.
I wish I could post the Don Draper meme, I feel bad for you, I don't think about you at all.
Yeah,
like that goes on the cover of this.
For what I want campaigns to learn is like learn how to do vertical video right. Like, if you can't do it on TikTok, then like go home and try again.
That was the other thing we were all kicking around last week, was the social media platforms and who's on them by age and all that kind of stuff. And yes, your mom and dad are still on Facebook, but if you're looking to engage youth, that is not where they are. They're on TikTok. So yes, please do a vertical video, as we do with our clips, of course. TikTok is actually our largest viewing audience, which is interesting because, as we often say, we may be young, but we're actually all really old. Speaking of old, the one other piece of math I'll do before we move on to the next topic is, the PCs did have their convention over this period, and I think maybe this stoked some of these fears that we were just talking about in the membership of like, oh God, we got to get going, yada, yada. Because Ford, of course, said, I want a fourth term. And he has said in the past he wants to be the longest serving premier. So I did some math. That would take him to 2042 when he would be 78 years old. So God willing, we defeat him well before then. because no one wants to
You
see
could run-
that.
It's 74, 78, 78. Is that what you said?
78.
Yeah, he'll run for
78.
U.S. president at that point. He'll be a spring
I was
chicken.
going to say, like, he would be the age that Biden was when he ran for president and won. So horrifying thoughts. So moving on to the other big topic, which was, of course, like the two things that people talked about constantly with this race was when's it starting, when's it ending, and how are we going to be voting? Because people have been advocating in the party for a very long time for online voting. I am one of those people. There are obviously some risks with online voting. There are risks with any voting system. Like, we actually have very strong election systems in Canada, but they're not impenetrable, of course. And online voting is the same. We have seen it adopted well at other levels, so we know it is possible. But this was the conversation. I think a lot of people thought they don't really want to do online voting in the party, but I think they see how popular it is and they're going to have to move to it. More charitably, they were looking for vendors to be able to facilitate this process, and that's part of why this has been slow. But the question I want to pose to you guys is, how does adopting online voting reshape this race? Maybe Jordan, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think it's already starting to reshape the process just because of how long it has delayed it. It's our first time doing it. We're quite anxious about it, even though they just did it federally. Not everyone had the same experience federally. But my understanding is that they've got the person who was the CRO federally to be the CRO for our race. So that's a good sign. And I think this will mean, like for folks who weren't part of that federal race, it's going to have a big impact on team neutral, because that's a lot of training that, volunteers have to do. Like, how do you verify ID? How do you answer questions about that to party members who are asking, like, where do I go? What do I do? Like, where's my ballot? Where do I vote in person? Right. So that's a big transition. And then there's also this aspect of, like, when you do it in person, you need a big team of like 400 people across the province to go and man voting locations. But this is going to require, I think, a smaller team that's more specialized. So you need more time to train them on how it all works and like how to support the campaigns. But hopefully that will reduce the human resources cost on Team Neutral significantly and replace them with the cost of buying the online voting software, which is, I think, a big part of why the fees are a bit higher this time, is to buy that stuff to make it go. Very technical language.
I'm pretty sure there's a Star Trek episode where they say Geordi makes things go, so that's why I'm laughing. But Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think moving to online voting is just sort of baseline expectations now for what accessibility needs to look like, at least in a race where there's no sort of chicanery that's trying to, engineer a particular outcome. And,
no,
exactly. Never happens with the federal conservatives when they're trying to get a new leader. And the reality, I think, is that accessibility is good, and it, sunshine is the best disinfectant, and it looks good on the party, I think. But, again, not to be the message guy, it's the message, not the medium in this case, but accessibility without party identity just means more people voting within a party system that has no identity. And so, again, there's all the nuts and bolts that are really important, but I think everything ties back to what is the party about, and how does the leader embody the new direction for it.
Certainly, online voting is going to change a bit of the calculus from the campaign teams, because it's going to be a different group of people who might be voting. People who, as you guys have talked about, accessibility, making sure that it's really easy for people to be able to vote. It opens things up. So it's not just people who can maybe make it to a convention or who are going to necessarily, take those extra steps to actually go vote in a leadership. You're widening your audience a little bit. So you have to be a little bit less targeted maybe. But I will just add, like, it isn't going to be easy. The federal system worked really well. Jordan, as you said, like, myself, I pushed a few buttons, went straight through, but I also have lived in the same place. My ID matches everything. So like, I don't have any issues that may crop up. Maybe you're a student, you don't live where there's a lot of things that can really hamper that ID process. And I can guarantee you that campaign teams will spend a lot of time on this issue during those 2 weeks, making sure that their members are actually completing the identity verification steps and going through with the voting. There's gonna need to be a huge support team centrally that can answer phone calls and reply to emails and help people through this process, because no digital system, especially when it's being used for the first time, is going to be perfect. So it is going to be a significant lift for both central and campaign teams to walk through, especially when you talk about more senior supporters, folks. Like I said, anyone who kind of has different addresses, different names, anything like that, like those are just going to complicate any sort of automated system. And I think the biggest thing is that both teams and central need to be ready for that. I
saw a stat that, this is in the US, but I think you can probably extrapolate here, that the average renter moves every 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And I've brought this up in the past because when you think of an election cycle, like that's enormous in terms of authenticating where they live and changing ID and all that kind of stuff. Now, to be fair, that would all be true if you had to show up at a voting location and had to figure out all that stuff too. To Daryl's point, I think it's really important to have a whole dedicated team for things like that, where it's really, really challenging. And you would have this at a normal convention as well. You have a credentials table where anyone who has weird shit going on gets sent to that table, and they deal with the staff instead of like, the random volunteer who's been trained on this thing. So that is an element of it. Daryl, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing that's hugely different though. Credentials desk, you're working with staff, they've got access to the database. They're just going to look you up, figure it out, and make the problem. In the federal case, at least, we had to deal with Canada Post. People are going to like Canada Post locations and asking about Identity Plus and being told, we don't know what that is. So like, when you're adding in like a whole separate organization, and like the people, they don't have any idea about this, again, I'm talking experience for what we did in, last year, but they're getting to post office. The post office is like, I don't know what Identity Plus is. I can't help you. So like so I think that's a big difference between like a credentials table where you have staff, they have access to liberal lists, they know what's going on, versus literally going into like a random Canada Post location in rural Ontario and being like, I need to, and again, I don't even know if this is the system they're going with, but assuming that there is sort of Identity Plus verification system, and it does go through Canada Post, like that will be a difference.
Yeah, and just on the renter household note, because I never miss in polite conversation the opportunity to get this data point into the conversation. But I don't know what the Ontario-wide number is, but in Toronto, and people are always shocked by this, 50% of the population rents. Yeah. So there's this notion that, this is an edge case, or we can come up with a process or a strategy that relies solely or mostly on homeowners and we'll be fine. But 20% of the population of Ontario lives in Toronto, and 50% of that 20% are renters. So you better get it right.
No, it's a great point. It also speaks to, like, again, people have different needs, and usually when you're designing a system, like, you should be thinking about all the iterations of what could be possible, but alas, that is not often how most people create things. So, again, it'll be really, really important to think of those things in advance. Like, even to Daryl's point, like having Canada Post, like when you have a partner like that, whether they're willing or not, I guess in that case, you need to be able to reach out to them and say, hey, tell your affiliate locations, like, this is going to be a thing. And, I really like the Canada Post solution because, like, that's something that's in most communities. It's accessible to people who are voting, and they are professionals, they are skilled, they know what they're doing. And the app itself was great. Like, my favorite thing about voting online, I voted from fucking bed. It was the best. Yeah. Like, I have never done that in the past. I want to vote I like going to a polling station. Sure. I wish we had the Australian model where you either got a sausage or a piece of cake. Like, let's lean into the party element of it. But if we're not going to do that, I just want to lie in bed and vote, and that will be this, and just do it first thing in the morning and be done. The thing that for me, advocating for this policy for a very long time. And, I've had the debates with, Simon Tuntel, who's the ED at the party and was when I was there as well. We've had these debates about online voting and like the security of it and all that kind of stuff. And I've always thought that the benefits outweigh the negatives for it. And it's really a question of like, who are we inviting into the party? Like when you're having a leadership race, it is all about bringing new faces in and expanding the tent. Not to everybody. Some people don't want to do that. And that's why they like other methods of doing things. But in theory, if you would like to gain power, you should grow your base. And this is your opportunity to do it. And I've advocated in the past about reducing fees for things because we become a bit economically elitist, and that is just not where Ontario is at. People are struggling. Most people are making, like the average income in the province was like $54,000 or something. Like it is not what a lot of the elites in the party make, all the lawyers and other people who have these great consulting jobs or whatever it is. Like that is not the average experience in the province. And so we can't keep our membership only to that, and we need to be inviting other people in. So when I see online voting, I see that it's removing a cost barrier in terms of you don't have to go to this convention, spend $1,000 plus a hotel plus travel, like whatever it is. You don't have to spend all this money. You can just, in our case, in this party, we have free membership as well. So you can just take out a membership and then vote for free. Like there is no barrier. And some people see that as a negative because it means you can flood the zone with people. You know what? I like to trust voters. I like to trust the process and human beings. And I think that's an important element of it. I also think just like, even in terms of like turnout, like if you don't have people have to go stand in a line for an hour or two to get their IDs checked to actually vote and all this kind of stuff. Like it is fun to stand there if you know the other people, but say you don't. Like people have jobs. A lot of like not everybody, some people work in retail, some people work shift jobs. Like there are a lot of jobs where you can't actually afford to stand in a line at all, or you can't do it between the hours of 2 and 5 on Saturday, one weekend of the entire year, which is often what these leadership meetings tend to be when we've done them in the past. So this really opens up the availability of the voting process because, of course, it's online for a week. That is ample time for pretty much anyone to be able to go vote pending like, personal disaster or something like that. That opens that up to people in terms of like their scheduling availability. Even just thinking of people are caregivers, whether it's like a sick parent or something like that, or a relative, you have kids. There are so many different things that get in the way of people participating. And I've always been of the belief that you have to make it as easy as possible and remove every barrier possible to people voting, whether you think they're valid or not. Like it doesn't matter. The idea is to engage people and get them involved in politics. So you open it up as much as possible. And I really think online voting does that. And that, that's why I've always supported it. But I just think it'll be interesting to see how we embrace this, how each of the campaigns embrace it. I also think like, I don't know if you guys have thought. So there's two things I was thinking about when Daryl was talking. One was, I was thinking of the 2013 federal race, which was actually a bit hybrid because they had remote voting. I think it was a pin. Was it a pin online or was it mail? Whatever. I can't remember anymore. But they also had online, they had in-person voting at the convention center as well. We aren't doing that, which I think is a good strategic move, just like operationally, because that's too much different stuff going on. So everybody votes online. But the visual people in the party, like Daryl, still get their good visuals for the announcement and the HQ announcements, which we saw federally as well. So you do have that big visual at the end, which is really, really important. So there's this conversation, Jordan brought it up, like the cost piece. Well, yeah, this still costs a bunch of money because you got to get the vendor to do this process. And you're not saving money by not having a convention. Conventions are very expensive, but you're still having an in-person event one day instead. So, it doesn't change the expense conversation from the party standpoint, but I think it does open up access, but you still get that key visual at the end of the winter, which, they played the Carney stuff for quite a while.
I mean, they're still using footage from that evening, photos from that evening in digital ads. So like, yeah, 100%. And I think both are really important. I think online voting, like you said, totally opens up for accessibility and makes it, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer in 2026. People demand to be able to do things online, and not offering that is not a good idea. But yeah, those visuals, like those are the most critical things for a political campaign, is to have those great everyone celebrating with their signs and yelling and red lights everywhere. Like, it's so important from a visual storytelling perspective that you kind of have to have it. And then being able to plan the event and, someone, working in production on conventions and things like that. Like, when I'm going into these things, I'm thinking about it as an ad shoot. I don't care about the event. I'm thinking about, like, how do I make this an ad shoot? How do I get the shots I need? How do I make sure that the audience is where they need to be and set it up for that purpose? Because sure, the people in the room are going to have a good time, but there's way more value for the party to have really great visuals coming out of that.
The one thing we didn't really dig into as much is the interference piece. Now, there's the natural things that come up, as we mentioned, with people's IDs not working or whatever the case through the verification process. There are campaign shenanigans that happen, of course, too, where people say that person is not a member, and they're just, not a member for them. There's all those kind of things that happen, but there is the interference piece. Now, I may be maybe a bit naive to think like foreign interferers care a little less about Ontario than, say, the federal campaign, at the national level. But there is that concern about digital technology and voting that way. Do you guys have thoughts on that? Do you care? Do you think it's remotely a real problem? Daryl, you may remember too, like, I know the federal party did a lot of checks on that front to make sure that nothing was going on that front. And I don't know a lot of details about it. I don't know if you do either, but there was a process for making sure it was secure.
Yeah, certainly. And that came down to that identification process, right? Like, every single person had to be a real human that lived where they said they lived, and it had to match, like I said, whatever their membership was. So that was kind of what that was. And ultimately, I think that is super important. I would probably kind of tend to agree with you, Teresa, that, the foreign interference is probably not all that likely to be a huge instance. But that's not to say that the party doesn't have to be smart and protect against it, right? Like, you can't, even if there's no threat, which I don't think there's no threat, but even if there's little threat, the party still needs to be seen as taking an active position, making sure that they're doing everything they can to prevent it. And also just making sure that, coming out of the election, everyone, regardless of who they voted for, feels like it was fair and the person who was supposed to win won.
There is like a bit of a threat, and I'm not, and it's not foreign interference per se, but when I was working at the party, my colleague went out of the office to grab lunch, got an email from our boss to go, please pick up a bunch of iTunes gift cards, please. And she came back into the office. She said, hey, like, got those iTunes gift cards that you asked for. My boss was like, I didn't ask for any iTunes gift cards. Someone had been watching and knew when she had left the office. So, like, it does happen.
Yeah.
And, like, especially now, I'd be more worried because there's more people mad at Canada, and Ontario's kind of the driver of this bus. So, sorry, BC, I love you, but no. So yeah, I would be a little worried, but I think Simon would be even more worried, and because of that, he's going to make sure it's locked down.
I will say that's a good point. Like, these phishing schemes and things like that, that happen through emails and stuff. Like, we always talk about the voting apparatus as if that's the only way these things can happen. But, that is one past example. But there are many others of people needing to learn more and more, like, do not click on that link. This is not the link you should click on. That will cause catastrophe. Even in the campaigns, like, I actually think, there's the party part of it, but, like, in a campaign where you have random volunteers being like, okay, cool, and they're just learning how to do things.
Sharing passwords, my nightmare.
Oh my God, yeah.
Well, I'm not getting paid for the campaign, but I'm gonna win a free cruise.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, for when it's all over. Yeah. So, like, the sharing passwords one specifically, like, Daryl, absolutely. Like, especially on nowhere is it worse than on the back end of a candidate's website where everybody's like, we'll just use whoever's password. You can create unique passwords for people. You don't have to share. Please do.
Yeah, please.
It still hurts.
So I want to talk about the candidates for a little bit. So again, we've talked about how there are these financial deadlines, and we've had a lot of conversation about why there are two start dates and whether that is just more or less circumventing the Constitution anyway, to say that it is, 140 to 180 days out from the actual date. But, whatever. I'm sure someone could litigate that rules wise, but, I don't think anyone will find that interesting or like that from a voting perspective. But we are creating this window now because of that, where they're starting the timer today, February 9th, and candidates have up until July 31st to enter the race. What does that 6-month window look like? How does that impact who enters and when, from your perspectives? Alex, maybe start with you.
Yeah, I mean, setting aside the sort of edge case, if you will, that Teresa, you mentioned earlier with respect to municipal politicians and the timing there. It's a long runway, and so it widens the pool of potential candidates. The phrase is a week is a long time in politics, but we're 5-6 months here. So functionally what it means, among other things, is that none of us know what the issue du jour is going to be on July 29th, or more critically, maybe July 1st, because how quickly can you really get a campaign together? If there's a crisis that strikes the Ford government on June 28th, does that convince someone who otherwise wasn't interested in being in the race to throw their hat in the ring? Obviously, the Carney parallels here are obvious in that sort of scenario. But I think the length of the runway itself doesn't determine who runs. The perceived chance of winning is what determines who runs. And especially when you start to talk about names who haven't already been bandied about as potentially being in the race. So if the field stays as it is today, it'll be because the ultimate prize doesn't feel real. If conventional wisdom still in early July is that Ford isn't vulnerable, it's not going to attract people who aren't already in the race. But like I said, I mean, that's 5-6 months from now, so who knows what happens between now and then that might encourage someone else who's not currently on the list to throw their hat in.
The way I've been thinking about it is just like purely from a financial perspective, because Jordan, I think maybe you read deeper. I wasn't paying attention. I think you said there was $1 million spending limit. Did I make that up?
I know someone else mentioned that, but yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So with $1 million spending limit, that sounds like a shit ton of money. But at the end of the day, if you're running a 10-month race that doesn't actually get fully serious and who's really in that far into it, and then there's still 4 months afterwards, the campaign, like that's a lot. In some cases, you might be paying out the candidate with that money because they're taking a leave from their job. So that's an expensive piece of it, as we have learned from recent leadership in the party, that it does cost a lot of money to pay a prospective leader. So there's that element. There's your chief of staff, who I sure as hell hope you're paying over the course of this time, because that is a huge role. There's a few other key campaign roles that I really hope you're actually spending money on too. Now, it is lovely that people volunteer in politics, but oh my God, pay the people who are helping you, because we need to develop talent in this party, and you actually need to pay people so that they can take time off work and other things to do that. So all of that costs a bunch of money. Voter outreach costs a ton of money. We're going to be looking at, with it being a fairly remote race at this point, candidates are obviously going off to riding associations already. You may have seen on Instagram and stuff like that, like the pictures of like a bunch of potential candidates have gone out to specific riding associations. So there is that, but a lot of this will be done remotely with phone calls, with digital ads, things like that. And there are big costs to that. And by extending the race, we can have a separate conversation about, whether this is trying to avoid bias in the first place. But extending the race, you really do limit who can get in. And I think a lot of people agree with that choice, because they only want people who can raise a ton of money and are willing to spend that money to win. So that will eliminate a lot of people who maybe don't have strong fundraising experience, maybe don't have deep networks, things like that. Those people, they may enter, but then quickly exit as well afterwards. And we have seen some people already in the last week, not necessarily for that reason, but who have said, nope, I'm not going to run. This isn't my thing. And now that, the date is known, I think a longer race does tend to push a lot of people out who are willing to commit if they can do it quickly. We see this with nomination races too, where high profile people they might leave a week before the campaign to come out on the campaign because they just can't sacrifice their work ahead of time. So that's a really important piece of it. The other part of it is, like Jordan, maybe getting to you, like,
Sure.
we've had this conversation about Nate Erskine-Smith specifically, and he's come out very early into this race and said, I'm going to run. I don't think that surprises anybody. But he was also kind of pushed by the fact that this perfect opportunity of a seat in the form of a by-election has opened up in the riding next to his. And there's a sitting MPP for the Liberals, one of the few we have, in his current federal riding at the provincial level. So there was always this question of, and he has said he wasn't going to push her out to run if he became leader, he would find another riding. And this is the perfect option for him because it borders his riding. It's very, very close. And the by-election at this point has to happen within 6 months, which is under the period that the leadership is happening. It'll even be wrapped up, I think, maybe, because it just has to be called within 6 months. And then there's, the RIP period. So it might even be wrapped up by the time the leadership candidate deadline happens. But that's an important element of it. It's also an important element of why this timeline was chosen, I think, in the first place, because there is the argument that the also ran from last time has the greatest advantage with a short race because no one else has time to organize. I'm sure you have thoughts about all these things.
Yeah, I think the consensus out there is that it's Nate's race to lose. And I think that a shorter race would benefit him because he still has a, maybe not his entire organization from last time, but a lot of it. He's got the name recognition from last time. He fundraised well last time. He came in second, I think, for fundraising. And he's got name recognition, and he has really cleverly steered into this, opportunity that has fallen in his lap, I think. He has the benefit of, he's already a bit of how do I put this? He's already kind of decided that he was going to make the Ontario move. Let's put it that way, and that's where he was going to end up. So why not go now? It makes sense, and it's next door. So I think there's a lot of, like, I've talked to a few people who are like, well, like, this is just ridiculous. Like, it's about the riding, it's about the local folks, like, it's about we don't want this to become like a zoo. And I'm kind of neither here or there on that. I think from the party's perspective, like, if people want to run for a nomination, they should be allowed to do so if they are able to be greenlit. And if you don't think that person should get the nomination, then go out there and organize against them and, kick him out. So I think I think it'll be interesting if the other candidates that also don't have a seat provincially decide to dip their toe in. I think it would be, already having a leadership race at the same time as a by-election, I don't know if there's a precedent for that. But I think it will make this particular race very unique because, Nate has effectively put his fate in Doug Ford's hands in terms of when that is happening, which is a huge risk. But it's also a very bold move because it shows, like, whatever, like, call it whenever, I'm ready. So, I think it's a smart move that makes his position stronger. I think the length of the race itself gives a lot of chances to other candidates that might make them more able to beat Nate than they would have been if it was a short race.
I did want to talk about that piece that you were talking about giving more time for other people to enter. So Daryl, obviously, you had worked on Karina's campaign. She says she's not in this time. We've largely only seen federal MPs say they're not in, with the exception of Nate. This happening now, the deadline being July 31st, I can't believe the budget is still not fully passed. Like, well, but federal MPs are needed in Ottawa, and this gives them a much bigger runway to get into the race. They have plenty of time to organize behind the scenes and make their big launch later, say, I haven't looked at the actual calendar in a while, but mid-June usually is when the House rises federally. That'll still give them a month before the actual deadline to fully jump in and to raise that money officially and all that kind of stuff. Do you expect anyone else to jump in? And what other kind of candidates could come out of the woodwork because there is this longer timeline?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any like names that are currently floating around in the federal space, but I think what this long period does, especially right now with like murmurs of a snap federal election. I mean, you guys talked about municipally, but if there is an election this spring, where the Liberals were trying to, get a majority government when they kind of striking while the iron's hot. That could change an MP could lose that election. Even if the government wins, an MP could lose and then change their mind and decide, oh, maybe this is for me. Or, maybe because there's an election, they decide not to run. There's so many, as Alex said, like a week in politics, like 6 months, good Lord, who knows what could happen between now and July. And I think it really comes down to what does happen on the federal scene. Also, what happens on the provincial scene. There could be other MPPs who step down, other federal riding seats that open up. There's so many things that could happen. And I think what that does is, obviously it opens the door to those people to change their mind later, decide in May or June that, this maybe is something I want to do. But what I also think, it makes it a little bit awkward for this group of folks who, the names that, we've all heard who most likely will be launching in the next few weeks because they want to get out there. They want to start fundraising. They want to start spending money. They want to start doing all these things. So then they're kind of in it for the long haul, and they kind of set their goals, figure out what they're doing. And then, 6 months from now, the whole race could be thrown because some random new person, random's maybe the wrong way to put it, but some new unthought of candidate all of a sudden enters the race, and then the latter 6 months of the race is all flipped upside down. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that would be good for the party. I think it'd be good for the race. It would make sure that person was able to kind of pivot and do different things. But from their perspective, they're probably not going to be super happy about it. If especially a star candidate, right? And that's really what I'm talking about. Like someone who is an MP or does have already a following, who in the preceding 6 months decides, maybe this is something you want to do. I think it could really upset the race, and like I said, for the good.
Those are really interesting. It's a really interesting point for two reasons, because the first point is like, all those people you were just talking about, we haven't named any of them here, but we all sort of know who they are. There's a bunch of people who are just like ready to go to announce their campaign. And I don't know if they assumed this was going to be a long timeline anyway, and that it hasn't changed their plans. But there is a danger of launching in February and then having all the momentum and the air of your campaign just sucked out over the next 6 months because nothing's going on. Like I don't imagine even before they have an official candidates list, like they're not going to be having debates. So you're just going to be going to local riding events, and there's going to be not a lot of media attention unless you're putting out like tons of policy planks and all that kind of stuff. So, until that happens, there's going to be no energy in these campaigns, really. And I don't think any of the candidates, no offense to them, I don't think any of the candidates themselves are like so exciting and new and out of left field that, they can generate that kind of interest on their own just by being a candidate. So there is that piece of it. And then, the surprise piece of like someone could jump in up until July 31st. That is so long from now. And I remember talking to Nate last time around, and this was like maybe November, December of that first period, like before the leadership even technically launched. And he said, oh, well, if somebody else was going to get in, they would have jumped in already. And well, it turns out Bonnie Crombie, who was insisting to her closest people over Christmas of that year that she was not getting in the race, by January said, hey, I'm getting in the race. And she was a very high profile candidate. She was a multi-term mayor. She had been an MP. There was a lot of people backing her from the establishment of the party. And that really did upend the race. And of course, she did end up winning. So, anything can happen in these races. And I always like, hope for excitement.
Oh, get the popcorn. I'm ready. Give me all the drama you can get. You can muster.
We have podcast episodes to do, so we need the excitement.
And it can't just be interviews with you.
Right? Like at the end of the day, we don't want to wait until July to have something else interesting to say about this race, quite frankly. But even just from a perspective of the party connecting with voters, like you do want some interest. Like we have seen in the NDP race, that's been the big complaint, that even though it's actually seemingly have been a bit of a close race, maybe not with Abby's fundraising numbers now, but it had seemed like maybe a three-way race, and everyone was kind of seeing it like a snooze fest because there just wasn't anything interesting happening about it, which is not great news for the party, of course. So I mean, this is the danger at this point, that you're going to have, okay, we're starting this race, and then until July. Like I do think that's a bit dangerous. I don't know how staggered these will be, these announcements, but
I think it's inevitable. Well, we're going to have a flurry of announcements. There's going to be a bit of excitement over the next few weeks, would be my guess. Then things will die away. Folks will go back. They'll focus on their own data building, list building, meeting people, fundraising, trying to spend as little money as possible, but raise as much as possible so that they are ready. And really, with the vote not even happening until, late fall, even July, there might be, again, like another fur activity. We'll have some debates announced. That'll happen over those months, but it's still going to be a bit of a snooze until September, till the membership kind of get cut off happens and we actually start getting close to the actual race. Like that's when things are going to really pick up. So regardless of what happens, who enters the race, whatever, it's just a long time. And I think campaigns have to be ready to not gain momentum right away and try to hold that through till November, because it's not going to happen. It's just simply not going to happen.
We're closer to the last November than to this November.
Exactly.
It's a long ass time.
It is. Yeah. At the same time, like, because we'll have financial results being reported every 2 weeks, if someone runs away with it quickly, it could be very interesting. Like if someone, like, I don't know, I feel like, I don't know if this is the guy, but I feel like in this race, like if Crawley comes out with $400,000 in the first couple of weeks, people are gonna be like, whoa, like maybe thinking twice.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because in my head, as we were talking, I was thinking about a few different races. So I was thinking about 2013 provincially, 2013 federally, and then 2025 federally. So, Carney entered the 2025 race, and everyone was like, "Well, he's running away with this right from the start. Like he had all the endorsements, and it was very, very short, truncated race. But he didn't need the time to go sweep everybody off their feet and all that stuff." But then 2013 federally was a similar situation. Justin Trudeau entered the race, and there was like competent people. Mark Garneau ran against him. That's who I was supporting. Like there was competent people running against him, but it was a long ass race. Because I remember I was at OLP. LPCO was there. We were helping them run debates and things like that. So we were in the background and we saw this, and my God, not an interesting race at all. Very, very long. But the Carney race was not interesting at all either. And it was very, very short. So then you think of 2013 provincially, where again, I think that was a 103-day race. I had a whiteboard where I was knocking off all the days as we went through it. And that was an incredibly exciting race. So, timelines, while they can impact this, at the end of the day, it's the candidates that drive the interest, and it's the horse race of like how close it is. Because again, Kathleen Wynne and Sandra Pupatello, I think they were 2 delegates apart on that first ballot of that leadership race, and that is what drove all the interest. Then, of course, there was the wonderful speech the eventual premier gave as well, and so events can happen, and the timeline, it can impact that, but at the end of the day, like it's not necessarily what's driving the excitement in a race. So as we go along, as usual, we did want to talk a little bit about the messaging that we see from these candidates. So obviously, a leadership campaign is a sales pitch to the voters about what they want to see in Ontario from the eventual premier. And, it's a way for people to weigh in. I'm wondering what you guys are thinking, both in terms of sort of narrative framing, and then what are the key issues that these candidates should be focused on? Because, like, I have written a campaign platform. Everybody wants that to be a deep policy document that's 80 pages long and talks about the minutiae of everything. And like, that's not what campaigns are, whether they're leadership campaigns or general elections. You're trying to give people a really, really high level program of what you're going to do and convince them that you're the one who can do it. What do you think that looks like, Jordan?
There's 3 big things that I want to see from candidates. One of the really big ones, and one that's been a bugaboo for us for a while, is we need to bust the myth, or at least like take a big chunk out of this perceived conservative halo on the economy. Like there's this myth that conservatives are better at managing government spending and creating jobs and making life affordable for people. And I don't know how you guys feel, but does like Toronto feel affordable to you right now? Like, does the rest of the province feel affordable to you right now? Who's been in the driver's seat for the last 8 years? It's the guy, he's down the street from me, actually. So like, I don't know how they always beat us on this because they're not good at it. So I think we need to stop being like, oh, like they have more, like, no, like, of course they have more perceived brand credibility on it because we never fight them on it. So take the fight to forward on the economy. Number two, we need to offer, I think, some easy to understand ideas on how we can like concretely make people's lives better and put money back in their pockets. Like this, I think, is one of the great takeaways from the Mamdani campaign, like tangible, easy to understand things that are going to make people's lives better.
You're gonna get Alex going here. You can't bring up Mamdani.
Hey, you mentioned him in an episode before me. That's breaking the rules.
Well, I think, and like there's so much to learn from him on that campaign, and we could probably do an entire episode about it if we wanted to.
Alex has been requesting that, so
all right.
And Teresa just was write a fucking article about it, which
we can do both. It doesn't have to be either or.
Yeah. I mean, the other great thing Mamdani did was like give people a sense of like direction and like optimism about the next year. And you know, we're all feeling uncertainty in the era of great power rivalry, as Prime Minister Mark Carney put it a few weeks ago. So I think like that's you kind of have to address that way that people feel. And I think we also need to like people understand that because our relationship with the US has changed, that so much of our culture and economy and everything is tied to that relationship. It means that like no matter who's in the White House, like we need to hedge our bets. But I think they've gotten over that initial shock. And I think that they are like still horrified at what's happening, but they've also realized like it's time for us to roll up our sleeves and build an Ontario that's more resilient and can weather these shocks more easily, so that we're not as reliant on our neighbor to the south.
Number one, I 100% agree. Something that sticks against Doug Ford has got to be like the primary goal of this from all of the leadership candidates. Let's just test everything, throw everything at the wall, see what sticks. They should all be trying different things, different angles, different topics, whatever it is. Something has to stick to this man, because without getting to that core central swath of people who are voting for the PCs, you have no hope. He will be the premier again. But taking it a little bit differently, what I really want to see from these folks is like some authentic, unfiltered personality. And I think that's something, and I don't want to be mean, but something that neither Stephen or Bonnie really gave us. You know, we never really got, who are you? What when are you going to get excited and talk to the camera like this about? Like, where is that real? And I think that's a big takeaway that I took away from Mamdani's campaign, is that it was him. It wasn't, and I think that a lot of people take the wrong lessons from that campaign, but he was authentic. He was himself. He spoke the way he spoke. He didn't try to be a liberal. He didn't try to be a politician. He was himself. And that's really what I want to see from these candidates. And if I was making a decision as a resident of Quebec and not a member of the Ontario Liberal Party, I will not be voting in the leadership. But if I was going to make a decision, that's what I'd be looking for, because there's lots of people who can come up with interesting policy ideas. There's lots of people who can, put together that platform. It's not necessarily going to be the candidate who's going to drive that. What the candidate has to drive is the relationship with Ontarians, and build something that people can say, oh, I trust that person. Oh, I like that person. Liking the person is huge, and it's going to take you really far. So really that's what I'm hoping to see from these folks is figure out a way to deliver their message in, a unique way that doesn't just sound like another liberal politician talking about healthcare and affordability. Like, it's so trite at this point. Like, you have to get in the mud, be a little more aggressive and dirty about it, and not in like a mean, nasty way, but in a let's just talk about this like humans talk, because we're in a bit of a mess. So how do we get out of this? How do we, and I think that is really going to be a huge difference maker come the next election.
I'm going to do a plug for our episode that dropped this week with David Peterson. Go watch it. It's about 70 minutes long, but it's really, really good, I think. Well, at least his answers are. But it's something that I think about with the 1985 campaign, because I want a core narrative. People talk about, like, what is the Liberal Party? What does it stand for? Like, you need a core narrative. You actually have to sell a vision to people. You can't just be all dug towards the devil, because people will stick with the devil they know. So they're not going to jump to you unless you offer something better. And I think that core narrative has to be a hopeful message. It has to be a practical message. In 1985, what they did a lot of was, they said, you've had this PC government here for 40 years, and they think the status quo is working for you. We know it's not, and we're going to turn towards the future, and we're going to make sure that you have a share in that. And we need to be focusing on, what does the next era of Ontario look like? It can't just be, what is the next year? What is the next 4 years? Yes, you have to talk about the emergency things people are facing, but you need a long-term vision, because we know Ford doesn't have one. Like, Jordan was talking about the economic numbers, and the economic numbers that Ford inherited versus the one he has been expelling for the last 8 years, they're dreadful. Like, there are more people unemployed in this province today than when he took office. Why aren't we hitting that message all the time? Something I've whined about to the party is, that jobs numbers come out, I think it's the 7th every month. They come out every month. Put out a press release every fucking month about how terrible of a premier this premier is at being the jobs premier. This is what he talks about. So talk about it every month. There's ample opportunity, because his record is actually terrible. So you will have fodder every month. Go do that. So I think that's very important. One of the things I think that's extremely important, though, as you talk about jobs numbers and things like that, is to not make it about the macro. You have to talk about the personal family level. There's something I complain about with Mark Carney all the time, like this trickle-down economic approach. It does not work. You need to talk where people are, the kitchen table, all that kind of stuff. You actually have to make it personal. And Liberals are really bad about that. Like, Daryl, you were just talking about that in healthcare and education. We talk about system-wide stuff, and that is overwhelming to people. And it's also not really relevant to people. You need to talk about their local school. You need to talk about their local hospital. You need to talk about that knee surgery they can't book, whatever it is. You need to talk about the ways that these decisions are impacting people on an individual level, and how they're actually worse off than if Ford wasn't there. So all of those things. And then my main thing is solutions-oriented, message-focused policy. My God, writing the platform in 2022 was a very painful process. There was one weekend, and I've told people about this, I got tasked with writing the environmental section, and I was handed 25 pages, 50 pages, something. And I had to write the entire chapter over a 48-hour period. And I thought I was going to vomit, like, just physically, because it was awful. And I don't recommend to anybody to try and do that. And, these were pages I had been asking for months and months, but the policy wasn't done. And at the end of the day, no one gives a shit about the details of that policy. The bureaucrats, when you go implement it in government, do. But at the end of the day, as a sales pitch at the door, like, they're not reading page 82 footnote 75, right? Like, they're not doing that. The only details you need, you can do backgrounders for platform documents that, tell the experts and the journalists what the actual details are, but it's top line messaging for everything else. And it needs to be about solutions. It can't just be whining about how bad things are. So, I've said this to all the prospective candidates I've talked to. Please come up with a government accountability plan. This is the most corrupt government in the history of Ontario. They do horrific stuff across the board. It is their operating persona. So knowing that, and knowing there's going to be more and more scandals that come out as they govern that are going to distract from your message with Ontario, come up with an accountability plan where you can wrap up all of the problems they have created, all the own goals they have made on behalf of Ontario, so that you can then set that aside and talk about the things you actually want to talk about, which are healthcare, which is education, and tie those things again back to the economy. So, employers, they say that the great strength of Canada is our healthcare system, because they don't have to pay out for those things like they have to do in the United States. So talk about that as an economic weapon for this province. What is Ford doing right now? He's destroying our healthcare system, which actually makes us less economically competitive. Same with education. We know that is a great equalizer. It's how we make sure that we lead in the knowledge economy, which is increasingly a thing now that we're talking about AI and tech and all this stuff constantly. So if we are creating an education system that is just completely falling apart, what are we saying about how competitive we want to be economically, right? So tie those things back to each other. I think just the crisis that we have in the economy right now in terms of early career workers and then workers in transition, Ford is doing nothing for any of those people. The jobs numbers that came out this week were worse for people under 24, right? So people are not getting entry-level jobs anymore because they don't exist, because they're AI now. And that's a huge problem if you want people to have families and afford, you know, the typical 4-person family going forward and having kids and all that kind of stuff. So you need to actually invest in those people. You also need to invest in people in transitions. You know, the big solution that we saw this week out of federal conservatives was to remove the taxes on severance payments to GM workers. Okay, does that actually address any of these crises though? Like, yes, it helps them, and I would like more transitional help for people who are in those situations. But we're not addressing any of these situations. So again, we need to be investing in that and create basically a job safety net for people who are struggling in the economy. And, you know, I want to rant about housing, but I'm actually not going to do that yet. I do want to get to Alex's point, and I will just keep talking, but I do have some thoughts on housing as well. Alex, what are your thoughts on what the candidates should be doing?
Yeah, I'm actually not going to talk about housing for what. I didn't talk about either housing or Mamdani today, so gold star for me.
Are you you feel sick?
I mean, you know, I think all of those things are true, but you know, the Ontario Liberals don't just need better policies that people respond well to. They need to give voters a reason to care whether they exist. You know, it's back to basic stuff. It's, what are you about? Why are you running? What is the party about? Why is Doug Ford not the right guy in normal person, non-personality, boogeyman-based language to run the province? And, you know, I would argue that neither of the two Ontario Liberal leaders had very good answers to any of those very basic questions. And, you know, I think there has to be a recognition of where the party's at and how important it is to have good, clear, coherent answers to those really fundamental questions. You know, if I hear one more Liberal strategists say that we're the party of education and healthcare, I'm going to have a coronary. Like, we're not the party of anything right now. And everyone needs to get that through their brains in the leadership camps. You know, the parallels between where the OLP is now and where the Ontario NDP, where the federal NDP, where the federal Conservatives are right now is very interesting. They're all grappling with similar versions of the same sort of, you know, existential character questions, and those have to be answered this time around, you know, in convincing ways, where people aren't going to engage with the campaigns in any durable way. And again, you know, we've talked about it a few times in this episode, but this leadership contest isn't really primarily about running to be the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. It's about being premier and being seen by people as being premier material. And, you know, very often these leadership contests focus so much on who can win the party, and voters at the end of the day only care about who can run the province. So who can connote that the best, I really think, is the whole ball game at this point. And I think if I could ladder it all up to one thing, it'd be what Daryl said a few minutes ago: be authentic. You know, when you look at some of the politicians that people, you know, contemporary politicians that people tend to believe are most authentic, it's people like AOC and Bernie and Mamdani, but also Carney and Ford. Like, they're not trying to be people they aren't, and their personal brand, their political brand, just radiates from them. And, you know, I think, Teresa, you said this to me a while ago: if authenticity doesn't fit the candidate, you need to pick a better candidate. So that would be my parting advice for Liberal leadership voters.
This is always the challenge, right, though, Alex? Like, you know, and that dichotomy between, you know, selecting an Ontario Liberal leader and selecting the next premier, you know, when it's really hard to convince members who are voting, right, that that's what they should be thinking about, right? Like, a lot of people go into this with, like, I like this person, not I think they can win the election necessarily. So I think that's a really interesting dichotomy that the campaigns are ultimately going to have to face, especially if they feel like their candidate is both the former and the latter, right? Is to convince people that, yes, you like me, yes, I'm authentic, but yes, I can also be premier, and I have the chops to do that, and I have the skills to, go up against ultimately Doug Ford and win. So I think, reminding your voters, who in this case are going to be Ontario Liberal members, that that's actually what we're trying to do here. Not just get another leader who's going to be the leader for the next X months, and then we're going to do this all again. It really is like we have to be thinking about, and maybe we'll help them along with this thought process as the race goes on. But who is going to be the person who can actually be the leader of the province, not just the leader of the party?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a Nate Silver tweet that went up today that made me think about this episode, and he had a chart that showed how different American politicians are perceived by the left, the right, and the center. And his hypothesis was that the best Democratic candidate for the next presidential election is the one who progressives think is progressive and centrists think is a centrist. And when you look at the chart, the ones at the two poles of that chart are the ones who have been more successful, the ones where there's a smaller variance between perception among progressives and centrists and right-wing folks than the one where there's a big gap. And the mushy middle is that big gap where folks have lost a lot of elections. It's Liz Cheney, it's Kamala Harris, and it's not Mamdani and Ocasio-Cortez or, Vance or Trump. So that's sort of an interesting authenticity marker. And again, like, Daryl said, it's so hard in these leadership races to in the thick of it pull out and say, guys, there's a long game here, and that's the one that I'm playing.
Like, if you think about when you're reading a fiction book and you're introduced to a character, and immediately, like, you are, the writer will give you some things on, like, okay, this person, likes chocolate milk, like, maybe their room's a little messy, so in your communications as a campaign, like, you have to figure out a way to telegraph that to voters in a way that they can see what kind of person you are. Because the way that you're authentic with someone, even like we're being right now, like on this Google Meet, is different than like when you would meet someone at a coffee shop, and certainly different than, the way that you would put an edited video on TikTok. So like translating authenticity is the tricky part, but you can do it in a lot of different ways. And when you do it well, then you win.
I mean, and authenticity ultimately comes down to being bold. I mean, the people that we talked about, AOC, even Vance and Trump, they don't care. They know what they think, and they're going to do it. And they're just going to say what they think, and then that's it. Like, if you don't like them, tough tits. But I think that's the big problem, especially with a lot of centrist candidates, is they want to please everyone. They don't want anyone to think that they're wrong. And I think this is especially, liberals are somewhat technocratic, and like they don't I think, my personal view is that it's very much like, these are the ideas that we think are actually the best, and actually they are better. Like, not just that we think they're better, they're actually the best ideas. And I think that really, whoever the candidate is, needs to be bold in what they're saying.
Yeah.
And really just like not care that XYZ is not going to like this particular piece. You're selling a whole package. It's not just what you think about one particular thing. It's what do you stand for as a broader set of values. And the only way to get that across is by being very blunt about it and not mincing words, and not kind of trying to, half-ass it so that nobody likes anything you say. Like, that's not going to get you anywhere. That's just going to more just going down the center is just going to get you nothing.
Yeah, and there's an interesting nuance there, but Daryl, in the way that you use center, there's a difference between being boldly centrist and being wishy-washy centrist, yes, right? Like 100%. Most people would agree that Carney is a centrist, but he is boldly and authentically that, right? The thing that he's gained the most acclaim for since he burst onto the political scene here was a speech at the most elite grouping of people in the world where he quoted Thucydides, right? Like that is him leaning way the hell into his authentic self. And that's not about being, very, very far left or very far right or in the middle or anywhere in particular on the political spectrum. It's about being boldly authentic. And I think that's the lesson.
Well, and this Jordan brought up novelizations and stuff, and I was thinking maybe he was going to go into heated rivalry territory, and we were going to get that into this episode too, and so now we have. But there is a concept in fiction called an unreliable narrator, and the idea behind an unreliable narrator is that you cannot trust the perspective that they're trying to sell you. And I think that comes back to this authenticity piece. So when you see a leader, regardless of whether you agree with them on everything, you want to know that they fully believe what they stand for. And the other piece of that is we are living in really uncertain times. People want to be able to vote for someone and know what they're going to get with that result. They don't want them hemming and hawing and going back and forth. They want to know, okay, I may not agree with this guy, but he's going to vote this way on this issue, and he's going to do this thing on that issue, and I can at least expect that, and I can predict that, and I can plan my life based on that. There was a CBC show years and years ago, save the CBC. There was a CBC show where it was about Pierre Trudeau's time in office, and it was Comfier. He played Trudeau, and there's a point in the episode, I think it was 1972. They got a minority, and the advisor comes in and he's like, well, they hate you, but even the people who hate you voted for you. So, but it was this idea of like, he was a personality. He wasn't liked by all. He was an acquired taste to many, but at the end of the day, they knew what to expect from him. And it's this idea of like, even if someone thinks you're an asshole as a politician, they still understand what they're getting from you. I think it's the same of Stephen Harper as well. Like he apparently a very funny guy, behind the scenes and really interesting to talk to and all this kind of stuff. And, I remember Kathleen Wynne, when she first became premier, she came to a meeting at the party office and she was talking about how they had a nice conversation about their kids playing volleyball and stuff. And he was like completely personable. Now, everyone kind of saw him as like an emotionless robot when, in the public scene, but people still knew what they were going to get from him. It was this really calm, boring version. Despite how radical some of his policies might have been, the presentation of it was calm and boring. And people needed that. We were in an economic recession, right? Like these were not great times then either. And I think that's something, Carney's expertise and his boringness as well. He's got a great sense of humor too. Some people say they're very similar politicians actually in people, but that's the thing. Like people want to be able to expect what they're going to expect from a candidate. So it's why they vote for Doug Ford too. Like they know what's going to go on an issue to developers' pockets, but beyond that, they know what they're going to get out of this guy, and they vote based on that. And I think when people see a wishy-washy candidate who's trying to please everybody, at the end of the day, they don't please anybody at all, and then we end up having yet another leadership race. And I think we want to avoid that. So, that is our constant advice to people: be authentic. Like that's the thing people are looking for from you. Now, do they ever listen? Well, we'll see.
Well, and can we all add to that, Teresa, as well? Like if you have to know yourself really well to be authentic. So that's important, but you also have to make sure your campaign teams know you really well. Because if your campaign teams know what your brand is and what that authentic brand is, then they'll be able to make sure that shows up in your media releases and your events and your digital content and all the rest.
Okay, I will take this opportunity to get a Mamdani quote in here. So he on the campaign, he was on one of the talk shows, I think it was Colbert, and he was talking about exactly this. He was talking effectively about being authentically himself and sort of unapologetically so, and about how in his eyes that was actually granting him license with some folks who otherwise, wouldn't give him time of day. And Mamdani himself actually quoted Ed Koch, who was a former mayor of New York City, and he said, if you agree with me on 10 of 12 issues, vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 issues, go see a shrink.
Yeah, exactly. I love that quote.
I mean, maybe actually, I think Alex, you just maybe hit on something. We've talked about how this is always our advice: be authentic, be authentic. Maybe what we should actually be advising is be unapologetic, because that's really what it is. That it shows that you're authentic because you are unapologetic about your values, about what you stand for. And at the same time, to what Teresa said, it gives people a really clear view of what they're going to get, because there is no wishy-washiness. You're you. You're unapologetically you. And that is what I think politics in 2026 kind of demands.
Well, and it's why, despite the fact that we know Trump is the least authentic politician probably in the history of time, just given everything that he does behind the scenes and then what he says publicly, people feel like he's authentic because he swears, because he's coarse, because he does all these things that make him seem like he doesn't care what people think about him. He's there to do the thing he's there to do, and he's there to do it for you. And I think that's what people are looking for in a candidate, regardless, the policies and what they're saying is important, of course, but at the end of the day, they do want to be able to count on the picture that they've been sold in the first place. So we are very much crashing out time-wise here. So I think we'll have to put a pin on it for now. We will be back, whether that's in July or earlier. We don't know yet. We'll see how exciting the race gets. But, hopefully this provided some kind of insight into the race. And then as we get going into the machinery, of course, we all have a lot of experience with these kinds of races. So hopefully we can provide some insight there. But I think we'll leave it at that.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.